He almost didn't stop. That's the part of this story that gets me every time I think about it. Not the helicopter. Not the convoy of luxury cars. Not the fact that the woman eating his last portion of rice turned out to be one of the most powerful people in the country. The part that matters, the part that made all of it possible, is the moment before any of that happened. The moment where a tired man on a motorcycle, at the end of a long day, with $3.40 in his pocket and aching knees and absolutely no obligation to anyone, saw a woman standing alone on a dark road at midnight and made a choice. He almost kept riding. He almost did what any sensible, self-preserving, reasonable person would do. Mind his business. Keep moving. That's not a moral failure. That's just survival. When you're living the kind of life he was living, where every dollar is accounted for and every problem has a cost and every detour is a risk you can't necessarily afford, you learn fast that other people's business can break you if you let it in. He knew that rule. He lived by it. And on the night everything changed, he broke it. This is the story of what happened because he did. His name was Richard, and he was 28 years old, and if you looked at his life from the outside, what you saw was this. A single room at the edge of a neighborhood the city had written off. Walls so thin he could hear his neighbor's baby before the baby started crying. One mattress on the floor. One gas burner in the corner that clicked 4 times before it caught. He woke up every morning at 5 without an alarm because his body had long since given up the idea of sleeping past the point where it was useful. Before he ate, he checked his phone for delivery orders. Most days the orders came. The food didn't. He wore bandages on his knees before he put his trousers on because the cold got into the joints damaged from years of long rides, and if he didn't wrap them first, they'd remind him about it loudly all day. His delivery jacket hung on a single nail by the door. His boots, cracked at the heel but polished, always polished, sat beside the door like soldiers. His one good shirt, the blue one with the small white buttons, was folded neatly on top of his bag even though he had nowhere to wear it. He kept it folded because folding it was an act of quiet hope. A private belief that somewhere down the road, there would be somewhere worth wearing it. He survived on leftovers in the literal sense. When a customer canceled an order and the food was already prepared, sometimes the restaurant let him take it. On the days that didn't happen, he bought 1 packet of instant noodles and stretched it across 2 meals by adding more water than the instructions recommended. He had learned not to feel the hunger after a while. His stomach had become something he negotiated with rather than listened to. He was not a man who complained. That's the thing people who barely knew him somehow always remembered about him. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. He didn't sit on the curb and wonder why life had chosen him for this particular flavor of difficulty. He just moved, quietly, steadily, like a man who had made a private agreement with hardship and had decided he was not going to be the first one to break it. But here's what most people didn't know about Richard. Under his mattress, there was a notebook. And in that notebook, sketched in careful pencil lines on the nights when the loneliness got too loud and he needed to remind himself that this season was not forever, was a floor plan. A small motorcycle repair shop. Nothing grand. Just a place with his name on it, where he could fix engines and build something that belonged entirely to him. He had been saving toward it for years. Dollar by dollar. Ride by ride, careful purchase by careful purchase. He had one rule, the rule that had kept him out of trouble in a neighborhood where trouble was always looking to recruit. Stay out of problems that are not yours. He said it to himself the way other people said prayers. And it had served him well. It had kept him clean in a world that was always trying to dirty you. He would say it to himself on the night everything changed. It just didn't work that time. Her name was Florence. If you lived in this country and you didn't know that name, you had either been living under a rock or so far from power that power had simply never introduced itself to you. Florence Kingsley, 51 years old. Founder and CEO of a company with its hands in real estate, banking, agriculture, energy, and 3 other industries most people couldn't spell. The kind of woman whose photograph appeared in newspapers not because someone placed it there, but because the newspaper would have felt incomplete without it. The kind of woman who walked into rooms and the rooms rearranged themselves around her. Her voice was low, smooth, and precise, and when she used it, people stopped what they were doing not out of politeness but out of something closer to instinct. She had built that company from almost nothing. Started it in her late 20s with borrowed money, a rented desk, and a stubbornness that her rivals had spent 2 decades trying to defeat without success. She had survived 3 economic crashes, 2 hostile takeover attempts, a government investigation that found nothing, a media smear campaign that she had dismantled so efficiently it became a business school case study. Florence Kingsley did not lose. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply her record. Until 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, Florence Kingsley lost the only 2 things in her life that her money had never actually purchased: her husband Henry and her daughter Olivia. It was a car accident. A Tuesday morning. Completely ordinary in every way that Tuesday mornings are ordinary right up until the moment it wasn't. Henry was driving Olivia to a visa appointment. Olivia was 19 years old and had just been accepted to study architecture abroad. She had been so excited about the appointment that she had slept in her interview clothes the night before because she was afraid of being late. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. That was it. That was the whole story. The entire machinery of grief and before and after assembled itself around nothing more dramatic than a man who hadn't slept enough. The funeral was large. Of course it was. When Florence Kingsley buries her family, the world shows up. Hundreds of people. Black cars and white flowers. Colleagues flying in from other countries. Government representatives. A 40-person choir that sang so beautifully that even the people trying hardest to be professional lost that battle with their tears. And then it was over. The cars drove away. The flowers wilted. The phone calls slowed to a trickle, then to silence. The world, with its characteristic cruelty, simply continued. Buses ran their routes. Markets opened. The universe did not pause even briefly to acknowledge that Florence Kingsley's entire reason for all of it, the company, the empire, the decades of building, had been loaded into 2 coffins and placed into the ground on a Thursday afternoon. She went back to the house. That was the mistake. She and Henry had designed that house together over 2 years, arguing lovingly over every detail: the staircase banister, the kitchen tile, the placement of a single tree in the garden that Olivia had insisted on because she wanted something to climb when she was home on holidays. It was a house that told a story about the people who lived in it. And now those people were gone, and the house was still telling the story over and over and over to an audience of 1. Olivia's room was exactly as she had left it. Architecture drawings pinned above the desk. A novel face down on the bedside table. A mug with dried tea at the bottom. Florence had walked in once, seen the mug, and walked back out. She hadn't opened that door since. Henry's reading glasses were folded on his side of the bed, waiting patiently for a man who was never coming back to pick them up. Florence had taken to sleeping on the very edge of her side of the mattress, as if claiming his space would make his absence more real than it already was. The silence in that house was not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that has weight. That presses down on your chest and wakes you up at 3 in the morning with nothing to offer you but the full inventory of everything you have lost. Florence Kingsley, who had faced down boardrooms and governments and financial collapse, found that grief was the one opponent she did not know how to fight. Because you cannot outmaneuver it. You cannot call your legal team. You cannot restructure it or rebrand it or acquire it and fold it into something more manageable. It simply sits with you. And it waits. She lasted 3 weeks in the house. On the night that changed everything, Florence got into her car at 1:45 and told herself she just needed air. Just needed to move. 10 minutes of motion because motion at least felt like something. She drove out through her estate gates into the dark city and told herself she would come back. She didn't plan a destination. She just drove. Turned where the road told her to turn, went straight where straight felt easier than deciding. The city blurred past her windows and she didn't really see it. She was somewhere else entirely, Henry laughing in the passenger seat, one hand on her knee, telling a joke he'd already told her 4 times. Olivia in the back with headphones around her neck, looking out the window and narrating the structural flaws in the buildings they passed, in the serious voice of a girl who was already becoming the architect she would now never be. The tears came slowly and then all at once. And somewhere between the memories and the dark road and the crying, Florence missed a turn. Then another. Then several more. The city she had lived in for 30 years began to feel unfamiliar. The roads narrowed. The buildings shrank and spread apart. The street lights thinned. She pulled over, cut the engine, and sat in the sudden enormous silence. And she realized, somewhere between one breath and the next, that she didn't want to go back. Going back meant going back to the jacket in the wardrobe and the mug and the glasses on the wrong side of the bed. It meant accepting that her life was what it was now, a before and an after, and she was trapped in the after without a map, without a guide, without the two people who had been her reason to navigate it. So she sat. She sat for a very long time. Richard was finishing his last delivery of the night. It was 12:20. His knees were using the specific language they reserved for serious conversations. His dinner had been half a meat pie that a restaurant owner had pressed into his hand on his way out. Not charity exactly, but the particular kindness that passes between people who recognize each other's hunger without needing to announce it. He was taking the back road because at this hour, his knees made the route decisions. That's when he saw the car. It sat on the side of the road like something that had simply given up. Not broken down, no hazard lights, no flat tire, no steam from the engine. Just a car parked partially in the road, driver's door slightly open, the interior light casting a thin slice of gold onto the dark tarmac. Richard slowed. Stay out of problems that are not yours. He slowed further. The car was expensive. Very expensive. The kind of expensive that announces itself quietly, the particular shine of the paint even in darkness, tires that had clearly never touched a pothole because this was not the kind of car that drove on pothole roads. Which made it very strange that this car was here, on this road, in this part of the city, at this hour. He stopped completely. A woman was standing beside the car. She wasn't looking at it. Wasn't checking her phone. Wasn't looking at anything in particular. She was simply standing, her back slightly turned toward the road, her arms loose at her sides, her whole posture carrying something that Richard, a man with a limited vocabulary for things he couldn't fully explain, recognized instinctively as a person who had stopped fighting something. Every logical voice in his head said keep going. This was not his business. This was a wealthy woman on a dark road, and that combination led to exactly the kind of complicated trouble that had no good outcome for a man who looked like him and lived where he lived. Maybe she was already waiting for help. Maybe the help was 2 minutes away. Maybe he would walk over and 30 seconds later be surrounded by people asking questions he didn't want to answer. He sat on his bike for a long moment. The woman didn't move. He kicked down the stand. He walked toward her slowly, hands visible, the way a person walks when they want their intentions to be completely clear. She heard his footsteps and turned. He saw her face. And what he saw stopped him for just a fraction of a second. Because her face was not the face of a woman who was lost on a road. It was the face of a woman who was lost in something much larger than a road. Her eyes were swollen. Her cheeks carried the tightness of someone who had been crying and had run out of tears somewhere miles back and was now operating in the dry, hollow aftermath. Her clothes were expensive, the kind that cost more than Richard earned in 3 months, but they were wrinkled in the way that happens when a person has been wearing the same thing for too long. When getting dressed and undressed has stopped feeling like something that matters. "Are you okay?" he asked. Simple. Direct. The most honest question he could find. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward. "I don't know where I was going anymore. Not, I'm lost. Not, my car broke down. Not, can you help me find my way? Just, I don't know where I was going anymore." There was something in her voice that was worse than distress. Distress has energy. The sharp, urgent sound of a person trying to fix something. What was in her voice had no energy at all. It was flat and quiet and sounded like a woman who had been emptied of the things that make a person want to go somewhere. Richard stood very still. He had no framework for this. No experience. No chapter in any book of his life that covered what to do when a stranger on a dark road sounded like this. He was a delivery man. He delivered things. That was the full extent of what the world had hired him to be. But he was also a human being. And the human being in him recognized something in her voice that lived in him too, that particular frequency of being alone with a pain too large for one person to carry. He knew that frequency. He had felt it on his own floor on his own bad nights. "Where do you live?" he asked. "I can help you get back." She shook her head slowly. Not rudely. Just no. As if the question, however kindly meant, had missed something essential. "I don't want to go back there tonight," she said. Richard looked at her. He looked at the car. He looked at the empty road going in both directions. He thought about his rule. He thought about the $3.40 in his pocket. He thought about his mattress on the floor and his gas burner and his tiny room with its thin walls. And then, because he was the specific, unreasonable, quietly stubborn kind of person he was, he said, "There's a place nearby. It's not much, but it's safe. You can stay until morning." She looked at him for a long moment, and he understood she was making a calculation, reading him, assessing him, deciding whether this stranger on a dark road with worn boots and a delivery jacket was someone she could trust. Whatever she saw in his face was enough. "Okay," she said. Just that. The way a person says okay when they've run out of every other option except the one standing right in front of them. The ride to his apartment was short and quiet. She sat behind him on the bike and held on with the careful, tentative grip of someone who had not been on a motorcycle in a very long time, or possibly ever. He rode slowly. He didn't ask her anything. She didn't offer anything. The city passed around them, dark and irregular and alive. He unlocked his door and pushed it open, and for one brief uncomfortable moment he saw the room through a stranger's eyes. The mattress. The nail with the jacket. The gas burner. The bare bulb overhead that flickered once before it committed to staying on. "I'm sorry it's small," he said. "It's fine," she said. And the way she said it, not politely but genuinely, told him that right now, a room this small was exactly the size she needed. No echoes. No empty spaces reminding her of who used to fill them. He boiled water. Made tea with the 2 bags he'd been rationing for a week. Put his last small portion of rice on a plate and set it beside the cup. She sat on the edge of the mattress in her expensive wrinkled clothes and looked at the food like a person who had forgotten that eating was something they did. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She thought about it. "Yesterday, I think." He said nothing. He moved the plate closer to her. He spread a wrapper on the floor and sat on it, because the floor was where he slept, and he had already decided she would take the mattress. She picked up the fork, set it down, picked it up again, and then, quietly, as if the room had earned her trust by being small enough that there was nowhere for secrets to hide, she started talking. "I buried my husband," she said, "and my daughter." The pause. 5 weeks ago. Richard didn't move. They were going to a visa appointment. Her voice was precise in the way voices get when emotion has burned away all the excess and left only the bare facts, which are sometimes the most unbearable part. A truck driver hit them. My daughter had slept in her interview clothes because she was afraid of being late. The room was completely quiet. "I've been driving since the funeral," she said. "Not every day. But at night when the house gets too." She stopped, searched for the word, and didn't find one. "I thought if I kept moving, maybe the feeling would." She stopped again. Richard waited. "If I stop," she said very quietly, more to herself than to him, "it becomes real." There was the true thing. The thing underneath everything. Richard sat on the floor of his small room at 1 in the morning and looked at a woman he had known for less than an hour. And he felt the full weight of what she had just said land on him like something physical. Not with pity. Pity was too small and too distant for this. With the specific, devastating recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be afraid that the moment you stop moving, the thing you've been running from will finally catch you. He didn't say "I'm sorry." He had heard enough "I'm sorry's" travel through thin walls to know they were what people said when they didn't know what else to say. This woman had already received enough of those to fill the church where she buried her family. He said nothing at all. And the silence that sat between them after that was not the silence of strangers. It was something warmer and stranger and more honest. The silence of 2 people who recognized in each other a specific kind of aloneness, even when the roads that had brought them to it looked nothing alike. She ate half the rice, drank the tea. He gave her his one blanket and lay down on the floor and listened to the city making its small nighttime sounds. He told himself, she'll be fine in the morning. She has somewhere to go. This is not your problem. You did what a decent person would do, and that's enough. He closed his eyes. He did not know, because how could he know, that while he slept on that floor, 200 meters of organized panic were assembling themselves on the other side of the city. Phones ringing. People in suits standing in driveways speaking in urgent whispers. Security teams pulling satellite data and phone records, moving fast and quiet through the dark. Someone in a room full of screens had gotten a ping from a GPS unit inside a very expensive car parked on a road at the edge of the city that nobody in that room recognized. Richard didn't know any of that. He just slept. And the morning was coming. He woke to a sound he had never heard on his street. Not voices. Not the early market noise. Not a neighbor's door. Something low and mechanical and multiple, a heavy, organized rumbling that didn't belong in this neighborhood the way a thunderstorm doesn't belong in a living room. He felt it in the walls and the floor before his eyes were even open. He stood up and opened his door. The road outside had become something completely different from the road he had left when he went to sleep. Cars. Not 2 or 3. Not a traffic situation. Cars lined up black and silver and enormous, stretching in both directions as far as the morning light let him see. The kind of vehicles whose tires cost more than 6 months of everything Richard had earned combined. Men in dark clothing stood in positions that were not casual, spread out with the specific deliberate arrangement of people trained for exactly this kind of situation. 2 of them spoke quietly into earpieces. And above all of it, above the cars and the organized stillness of it, a sound. A steady, rhythmic thudding overhead. Richard looked up. A helicopter was circling over his street. He stood in his doorway in his sleep clothes and worn slippers, and his brain simply refused to assemble any of it into something that made sense. 3 of the dark-clothed men moved toward him with a controlled urgency, not running, but not walking casually either. The first one reached him. Completely unreadable face. The woman inside. Is she here? Richard's mouth was open but nothing was coming out. And then behind him, footsteps. Turned. She was standing in his doorway, barefoot, her hair loose, her expensive clothes still wrinkled, her face carrying the particular stillness of a person who has just had the first dreamless sleep they've had in weeks and isn't yet sure how to feel about it. She stepped out into the morning beside Richard. Something moved through the crowd of security personnel like a current. Postures shifted. Men repositioned. The urgency in the team's body language transformed into something Richard had never seen directed at a real person, something that lived in the space between deep professional respect and something closer to awe. Madam Florence Kingsley. Not a question. An acknowledgement. The kind you make when you have been searching for something very important and have finally found it. Florence Kingsley. Richard heard the name and it landed on him sideways, like a word in a language he almost spoke. Like something he'd seen before but couldn't immediately place. And then it placed itself. Kingsley Group. The company logo on 3 of the buildings he made deliveries to. The photograph he'd seen on the front of a newspaper he'd used to line his shelf 8 months ago because he had nothing else. The name that appeared in conversations as shorthand for power, for a particular kind of wealth that had stopped being about money and started being about legacy and force. He turned and looked at the woman standing barefoot beside him. The woman who had eaten half his last portion of rice. The woman who had slept under his thin blanket on his floor. The woman who had said, "If I stop, it becomes real." 2 men with cameras pushed through from behind the security perimeter. Rapid-fire questions about where she'd been. Whether she was injured. Whether this was a kidnapping situation. Florence didn't look at them. She looked at Richard. For a long moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 10, time doing something unusual, she just looked at him. Eyes still swollen, but somehow fractionally less hollow than they had been at midnight. Something in them that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief and not quite recognition, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of all 3. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She turned and walked toward the convoy and the sea of dark clothing opened for her and closed around her again. Within 60 seconds, She was inside one of the enormous vehicles. The doors closed. The engines changed pitch. The convoy pulled off his street with the smooth, unhurried authority of things that had always belonged on better roads. The helicopter followed. The noise faded. The dust settled. Richard George stood in front of his small room in his sleep clothes, alone on his now empty street, in the specific silence of a man who has just watched something enormous enter and exit his life in the space of 8 hours. He looked at the road. He looked at the spot where the cars had been. He looked down at his worn slippers. He went back inside. The mattress still held the impression of where she had slept. The plate was on the floor with half the rice still on it. The 2 empty teacups sat side by side on his shelf like they'd always been there. Richard sat down on the floor and sat there for a long time. And somewhere in the city, in a convoy of luxury vehicles moving toward a life she no longer knew how to live in, Florence Kingsley pressed her hand flat against the cool window glass and felt, for reasons she could not yet explain, like she had left something behind. He told himself it was over. She was gone, back to her world, and that was how it should be. He would go back to his deliveries and his knee wraps and his $3 and his notebook under the mattress. He told himself this for 4 days. On the 5th day, he came home from his delivery shift to find one car parked quietly outside his building. No convoy. No helicopter. No men with earpieces. Just one car, trying not to make a fuss. And leaning against it in plain clothes, no entourage, no cameras, Florence Kingsley. She held out an envelope. "Thank you for what you did." Richard looked at the envelope. Then at her. Then at the envelope again. He didn't take it. "I didn't help you for money," he said. And something in Florence Kingsley's face shifted in a way that no boardroom rival, no hostile journalist, no aggressive government official had ever managed to shift it. Because for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had just said no to her and meant it. Had looked at money she was offering and simply left it in the air. In her world, when Florence Kingsley extended an envelope, hands moved toward it quickly, gratefully, sometimes desperately. The speed at which people accepted things from her had become so consistent over the years that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a door that always opens for you until the one day it doesn't. She slowly lowered the envelope. "Would you like some water?" Richard asked finally. Because he was who he was, and who he was could not let a person stand at his door without offering something. Florence blinked. As if she couldn't remember the last time water was the thing on offer, given simply, without performance. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They sat outside his door on 2 plastic chairs he dragged from inside. He gave her water in a cup with a small chip on the rim. She held it in both hands like the warmth was the point, not the drinking. And she started talking. Really talking. Not the smooth, sealed answers she had been giving everyone for weeks. "I'm fine. I'm managing. I'm taking it one day at a time." Those were constructed responses. Doors that let people feel they had connected with her without actually touching anything real. Richard wasn't looking at her with the careful, slightly nervous attention of someone aware of who she was. He was just looking. Waiting. Genuinely interested in the true answer, not the manageable one. So she gave it to him. She told him about the house. About every room holding a different memory. About the tree in the garden that Olivia had chosen because she wanted something to climb, and how it had grown 3 new leaves last week and she had watched them from the window. About Henry, who remembered everything, how you took your tea, the name of your mother, what you'd said 3 years ago, and how in a life where everything arranged itself around her importance, he had made her feel like she was the one who needed to arrange herself around him. "I miss being the less important person in the room," she said. They sat there for a long time. When she finally left, she paused at her car. "What do you do?" she asked. "When it gets heavy? How do you carry it?" He thought about it honestly. "I ride. I make my deliveries. I count what I have instead of what I don't. And I remind myself that the feeling has a bottom. It doesn't go down forever." She looked at him. "Does that work?" "Not always," he said. "But it's what I have." She nodded slowly, filing it away somewhere. She got in the car and drove away. Richard stood there one moment longer than necessary, watching until she turned the corner. Then he went inside and looked at the two plastic chairs still sitting side by side outside his door. He told himself he wouldn't see her again. He was wrong. She came back 4 days later. Then 3 days after that. Then twice in 1 week. Each time alone. Each time without warning. No calls, no messages. Just the quiet appearance of her car on his street and Florence Kingsley at his door in clothes that were always expensive but increasingly casual, like a woman testing the distance between who she was and who she might be willing to be for a few hours. Richard stopped being surprised after the 3rd visit. He started keeping extra water. He moved the second plastic chair outside his door permanently, as though it belonged there. He didn't examine what that meant too closely. She didn't come with agendas or requests. She just came. And they would sit, or he would be doing something ordinary, fixing a tire, sorting delivery receipts, and she would simply be present. She described it once, quietly, as the only place where nobody needed her to be anything. He understood that. He didn't comment on it. He just let it be true. On the 4th visit, she asked if she could come on his deliveries. He stared at her. The vision of Florence Kingsley, CO, on the back of his dented delivery motorcycle carrying someone's takeaway order was so architecturally impossible in his mind that he couldn't immediately find language for it. She put on the cracked visor helmet without complaint. She tucked her hair in without being asked. She swung onto the back of the bike with less difficulty than he expected. They delivered 6 orders that afternoon. She climbed 4 flights of stairs in a building with a broken lift without complaint, though he noticed her breathing at the top and almost said something and then didn't. They ate at a roadside stall at 4 o'clock. A plastic table, a bench, a plate of beans that cost $2. Florence ate the entire thing. "This is very good," she said, with the specific surprise of someone discovering the world is larger than their previous map of it. "The woman who makes it has been here 20 years, Richard said. "Hasn't changed the recipe once." "There's wisdom in that," Florence said. "Knowing what works and not disturbing it." She paused. "Henry used to say that. He said the more successful I got, the more I confused movement with progress." She set her fork down. He was right. He was usually right about those things. The name Henry fell into the conversation and they both felt it land. "What was he like?" Richard asked. She looked at him, clearly caught off guard. Not because the question was inappropriate, but because she realized nobody had asked her that. Not in 5 weeks of condolences and "I'm sorry's" and "how are you holdings." Everyone had spoken about the loss. Nobody had asked about him. About who Henry had been when he was alive and present and laughing at his own jokes and telling her she was confusing movement with progress. She talked about him for a long time. And then she talked about Olivia. Her face changed when she talked about Olivia. Deeper. Raw. The way a wound is different from a scar. "She was going to be better than me at everything," Florence said. There was no jealousy in that. Only pride so large it had turned into grief. She paused. She slept in her interview clothes because she was afraid of being late. That last sentence. Richard had heard it the first night and it had stayed with him. He heard it now and it did the same thing, landed with the specific force of a detail so small and so human that it somehow contained the entire tragedy inside it. They sat quietly for a while. The woman who ran the stall brought them each an extra serving without being asked, the way she did for people who looked like they needed it, which was a different thing from hunger, and she had spent 20 years learning to tell the difference. The visits continued. A rhythm developed without either of them discussing it. She came. He was doing something ordinary. She joined it. They talked or didn't talk with equal comfort. She started eating more. Not dramatically. She didn't announce it and he didn't comment. But the half portions became full ones. The tea she used to hold and barely drink got finished. She laughed more, small laughs still carrying that shadow of guilt around them that she hadn't fully put down, but more frequent. And then one morning, Richard saw the headline on his phone. Kingsley Group in crisis. CEO largely absent. Anonymous sources describing the company as a plane on autopilot with no one checking the instruments. Share price dropping. He put the phone face down. Sat with it. He understood everything she was doing. He understood it completely because he understood the logic of a person surviving a pain that has no manual, You find the places that hurt less and you stay in them a little longer than you should because the alternative, walking back into the full force of the life that grief has made unlivable, feels like something your body cannot manufacture the courage for. He understood it. He also understood that understanding a thing and allowing it to continue were two entirely different decisions. When she came that afternoon, he was sitting outside waiting. She saw his face and stopped walking. "What?" she said. He showed her the article. She looked at it. Her expression went smaller, more contained. "I know about it," she said. "My team has been sending reports." "Are you reading them?" The pause. "Some of them." "Florence." It was the first time he had used her name directly. Not madam. Not ma. Not a careful avoidance. Just her name, simply the way you say someone's name when you need them to actually pay attention. She looked at him. "The chair is not the solution," he said. "It's a break from the problem. There's a difference." Her jaw tightened very slightly. "I know that." "Do you?" He kept his voice level, unhurried. "You can come here. You can ride the deliveries. You can eat at Mama Linda's and organize my receipts and sit on that chair for as many hours as you need, and I won't say one word against it because I understand why. But you have people who have given their working lives to something that has your name on it, and you're—" "Don't," she said. Her voice had shifted. The authority that was always underneath it, always there even on the plastic chair, had moved to the surface. "You don't understand what it is like to walk back into that life. You don't understand what that house contains. What that office contains. Everywhere I look—" She stopped. "I know I don't understand that specific thing," Richard said. "But I understand running." He paused. "And I know what it looks like when someone is running and has started to convince themselves they've stopped." The silence that followed was sharp. "You think this is running," she said. "I think it started as surviving," he said. "And I think somewhere along the way those two things began to feel the same. And I think that is a very human mistake to make." He paused. "And I think you are making it." She said nothing. "If I go back," she said, very quietly, all the authority gone again. "Everything reminds me of them. The house. The office. The boardroom where I called Henry at lunch every day. The car park where Olivia used to wait on Fridays so we could go for dinner." She pressed her hand against her chest. "I don't know how to live there anymore. I don't know how to sit at that desk and make decisions about millions of dollars when I can't make the decision to open my daughter's bedroom door." Richard stood up. He walked to where she was standing. He stood in front of her and he said the thing that had been sitting in him quietly since the night he'd found her on the road. The thing he hadn't said because the timing wasn't right. But it was right now because he was the only person telling her the truth. "Running didn't erase the pain," he said. "You know that. You've been running for 5 weeks and the pain is exactly where you left it. It didn't go anywhere." He paused. "Stopping doesn't make it more real. It's already real. It was real the moment it happened. And it will be real whether you're on that chair or in your boardroom or driving in the middle of the night." Another pause. "You don't need to escape your life, Florence. You need to learn how to live in it again." The road was very quiet. Florence Kingsley stood on Richard George's broken tarmac with tears that she was not letting fall standing in her eyes like a held breath. And she did something she had not done in front of another person since the morning the police officer had stood in her doorway and cut her life into before and after. She let it crack. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way old wood cracks under patient weight. A sound almost too small to hear, and then the split. Her face changed. Her body changed. She put her hand over her mouth and the tears fell, finally, past the point where she could hold them. And she made no move to hide them from him. Richard didn't touch her. Didn't move toward her. He simply stayed where he was, close enough to be present, still enough to let her have the full weight of it without anyone trying to take it from her. She cried for a long time. When the wave had done what waves do, moved through and past and left a different quality of air behind it, she wiped her face with the back of her hand. Stood straight. "Breathe. I hate that you're right," she said. "I know," he said. She left that evening differently than she'd left before. There was something in the line of her back that had shifted, not the old armored posture of the so, but a different kind of uprightness. The uprightness of a person who has made a decision and is walking toward it before she can change her mind. At her car, she paused. Richard. Yes. I don't know if I can do it. I know. But I'm going to try. He nodded. That's all it is. She got in the car. He watched her go. And this time, it felt different. Something quieter. Something that was, in its own reluctant way, almost peaceful. He carried the 2 plastic chairs back inside. Put the kettle on. Sat on his floor in the silence that was just ordinary silence now. Not the silence of someone missing, just the uncomplicated quiet of a man alone in his room with his gas burner clicking to life. 3 weeks passed. Florence Kingsley walked back into her life the way Richard had told her to, not running from it, not performing her way through it, but actually, painfully, honestly living inside it. The first morning back at her office, she sat in her chair for 11 minutes before she could open her laptop. She looked at the framed photo of Henry on her desk, laughing at something off camera, one hand raised mid-sentence, forever making a point she would never hear the end of. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the laptop. That was how she did it. 1 minute at a time. One door at a time. She opened Olivia's bedroom door on a Wednesday evening alone, with no plan except to open it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the drawings and the novel and the dried tea in the mug and let herself feel the full crushing weight of all of it. She didn't clean the room. She didn't change anything. She just stood there until the standing became bearable. Then she went and made herself dinner. She called her executive team. Sat through the briefings she'd been avoiding. Made decisions, some wrong, acknowledged openly, corrected, moved on. Her team, who had been walking on glass for weeks, collectively exhaled. The investors who had been asking quiet questions stopped asking them. She was not the same Florence as before. She knew that. That Florence was a before person, and the before was gone. But she was building a new architecture for herself, slower, more human, with grief somewhere inside it rather than locked outside the door. And the building was happening. For weeks after the day Richard told her the truth on his road, she drove to his street on a Friday afternoon with a container of Mama Linda's beans, still warm, that she had found the stall herself and picked up earlier that week. She knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Nothing. She stepped back. The bare bulb was off behind the window. The plastic chairs were gone from outside, not relocated. The nail by the door had nothing on it. She knocked on the neighbor's door. An older woman who watched that street the way only people who really live somewhere watch streets. The man who lives here, Richard. Do you know where he is? The woman looked at her. Then at the locked door. Then back. He moved, she said. Last week. He said he had finally saved enough for his shop. She smiled slightly. He was very happy. He was singing when he carried his things. Florence went very still. He was singing. She stood on the road and looked at the locked door and the empty nail and the space where the 2 plastic chairs had been. She thought about the notebook under the mattress that she had never seen but that he had mentioned once, briefly, in passing. A small repair shop, nothing grand, with a particular quietness that she had understood even then was the sound a person makes when they are talking about the thing they are most afraid to want too loudly. He had gotten it. While she had been rebuilding herself in her large house and her large office and her large life, Richard George had been quietly doing the same thing on his scale, counting his dollars, keeping his rule, moving steadily toward the small precise dream he had been carrying under his mattress all along. And now he was gone. No forwarding address. No note. Just a locked room and a nail and the outline of a life that had briefly, improbably held space for her when she had needed somewhere to land. Florence sat down right there on the edge of the broken road. In her good clothes. On the ground. Right on the street where nobody would ever think to look for her. She held the warm container of beans and looked at the locked door and felt something moving through her that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite gratitude, but was made of all 3 in proportions she couldn't calculate. She thought about a dark road and an open car door. A man who almost kept writing. Thin walls and a chipped cup and a bare bulb that flickered once before it committed. She thought about if I stop it becomes real and running doesn't erase the pain. She thought about a cracked visor helmet and 4 flights of stairs and a woman at a roadside stall who had spent 20 years learning to tell the difference between hunger and something else. She thought about the man who had given her his bed and slept on the floor, who had refused her money, who had told her the truth when the truth was the only useful thing left to offer. And sitting on that road with the warm food in her hands and the locked door in front of her, she understood something, quietly, without drama, the way the most important things tend to arrive. He hadn't fixed her. He hadn't saved her. He hadn't been a destination or a solution or an escape. He had just been present. Honestly, simply, uncomplicatedly present. On a plastic chair, on a broken road, at the exact moment when her whole world had needed something that all her money and all her power and all her carefully constructed life could not manufacture. Someone who saw her. Not Florence Kingsley. Just her. She found him eventually. 2 weeks later, using the same people who found things. The shop was exactly as he had described it. On a narrow road. The kind of place that announced itself with the smell of engine oil and the sound of metal before you saw the sign. The sign was hand-painted. His name. Nothing fancy. Just, Richard George Motorcycle Repairs. The letters not perfectly even. She didn't go in. She sat in her car across the road and looked at it through the windshield. The door was open. She could see him inside, crouched over an engine, focused in the way he was always focused when he was doing something with his hands. A young boy, probably an apprentice, was handing him tools with the careful attention of someone learning something important. She watched him work. She sat with all of it, the gratitude and the grief and the strange, full, unnameable feeling that lived in the space where those two things met. Then she started her car and she drove. She drove the way she drove now. With a destination. With intention. Both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road ahead, not the road behind. The same city moved around her. The same noise and color and ordinary chaos of a life being lived out loud. And somewhere behind her, on a narrow road she had finally found after weeks of not knowing where she was going, a small shop with a hand-painted sign and a man who had almost kept riding. She rolled her window down. The air came in, warm and real and full of the city. She breathed it. And for the first time since everything broke, Florence Kingsley felt not fine, not healed, not whole, but something quieter and more honest than all of those. She felt present. Like a person who was learning, slowly, one road at a time, how to live in the life she had been left with. That was enough for now. It was enough. Here's what I keep coming back to with this story. Richard didn't have anything to give her except the things that can't be purchased, his time, his honesty, his floor, his willingness to see past what she represented and pay attention to who she actually was. And those things, those specific, unglamorous, uncomplicated things, turned out to be exactly what the most powerful woman in the room needed most. We spend so much time measuring what we have to offer by what we own, what we've achieved, what our name means. Richard had none of that. He had $3.40 and a room with thin walls. And yet, sometimes the most important thing you can offer another human being is simply to stop your bike, ask if they're okay, and mean it when you wait for the answer. He almost kept riding. He's glad he didn't. If this story meant something to you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me, when was the last time you chose to stop when it would have been so much easier to keep going? When did someone's presence, not their money, not their advice, just their presence, change something for you? Those comments are the best part of doing this. Every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is worth your time. I'll see you in the next one.